Hello friends, welcome back to How the Light Gets In. We have kind of a lot to talk about today. Today we're going to talk about Joker, the 2019 movie starring Joaquin Phoenix. I had so many thoughts. I had to make a Pepe Sylvia board. I don't really know what happened. I'm going to be honest, it got away from me. Hang in there with me. It's all going to make sense. That's all you need to know. Most importantly, and obviously spoiler alert, my intention is not really to review the movie or explain the movie or even really get into what happens in the movie, but it's kind of invariable. That's not the right word. It's gonna happen. So if you haven't seen Joker yet, you should pause this video and then you should go to a theater and you should watch it once, maybe twice, and then come back and push play. Okay. I need to say also that mental health and mental illness are not automatically precursors to violence. The vast majority of people with mental illnesses are not violent. And statistically, if you are mentally ill, you are way, way, way more likely to be the victim of a crime than the perpetrator of a crime. That having been said, the way that this movie handles violence is incredible. Because it's not like fun violence. And what I mean by fun violence is part of what makes John Wick a super great movie and really fun to watch is that it's fun to watch Keanu Reeves shoot 100,000 people in the head with crazy accuracy. It's fun. Joker is not fun. Joker is brutal and bloody and hard to look at. It's not supposed to be fun, and it doesn't have that pornography of violence feel that a lot of action movies in America do. And I really liked that they were careful about that, because for reasons that are probably really obvious, I think it would have been easy for them to turn this into a super fun Descent into Madness movie, and that's not at all what it is. Honestly, when I went and saw this movie, I went and saw it intending to be mad about it. I went and paid $10 to see this in a theater so that I could get pissed off and then film a video where I rant and raved about it. And that's not at all what happened. I went and saw it on a Friday, and I liked it so much that on Saturday I woke up and ordered some of those pens on Amazon that light up at the end so that I could go back on Sunday and take notes. So I saw it twice, and I think everyone should see it twice, because then the shock has worn off and you can more actively engage with the point of the film. So we've got all the upfront stuff out of the way, so let's talk about Joker. I got one of these too. So first and foremost, we need to talk about Joker as a film. It's so good, guys. I don't even know what to say. I don't have the nuances and the brilliance of Lindsay Ellis or other famous YouTubers who really pick apart films in beautiful ways. But this is an incredible film. The director, Todd Phillips, the way that he chose to capture this and build the environment of it's just beautiful. I watched a couple interviews with him, and one of the things he said that I really liked is that he wanted to create the idea that Gotham is really oppressive. So the city is kind of bearing down on Arthur the whole film. And the way that it's shot and the way that the set is designed really, really creates that feeling for you. The other thing that I really liked about this movie is that Arthur is so much the hero of this story. Any other time we've encountered the Joker in film or TV or any other media, he's a villain, and he's in and out, and he's not the central focus. But with this movie, he is. Arthur is in basically every single frame of this entire movie, start to finish, because it's about him. You may remember a few weeks ago we did a video about unreliable narrators. Really wish I had seen this movie before I filmed that video, because Arthur is very much an unreliable narrator. He fantasizes a lot. He fantasizes about being on the Murray Franklin show. He fantasizes about his neighbor. And this world that he builds for himself that isn't real. The way that he tells those stories to himself says a lot about who Arthur is as a person, which takes us to contextualizing Arthur. Arthur is incredibly depressed. He's also a professional clown for hire. And let me say this first and foremost, because if this movie taught me nothing else, it's that clowns are dicks. Like, not Arthur, but almost everyone he works with is kind of a terrible person. They're mean and they make fun of him and they don't support anything that he's going through, and they just kind of treat him as this like weirdo. I mean, you're all clowns. You're all a little weird. Let's be honest. But Arthur lives in Gotham, and we see Gotham in decay. Like, in the very early scenes of the movie, we hear voiceover from the radio where there's a garbage strike, and so for the rest of the movie, there's just mountains of garbage everywhere Arthur goes. There's budget cuts to all kinds of social services and other programs. In fact, later on in the film, Arthur loses his access to his therapist and his psychiatrist because of those budget cuts, which for someone like Arthur is incredibly destabilizing and really unlikely to allow him to come out positively. Even if nothing else in the movie had happened, that would still be a significant major problem for him. We hear Arthur say really early on in the movie that his purpose in life is to bring laughter and joy to other people. We learn over time where he got that sense of purpose and just how at odds he is with that sense of purpose. So if you view Arthur as being really at war with himself, I think that's a pretty accurate portrayal, because he's very much trying to be who he thinks he's supposed to be and really fighting against who he actually is. Joaquin Phoenix, when he talks about playing Arthur, he talks about Arthur having some traits of PTSD, which I think is very true and felt came through in the film. He's very hypervigilant. He's very on edge. He's aware of and looking for threats. And extra unfortunately for Arthur, there's quite a lot of threats for him to be aware of. So when we first meet Arthur, he is doing his whole clown shtick. He's got a sign. He's standing in front of a music store that's going out of business, doing like the twirly, signy, spinny stuff. And then some children steal his sign and he chases after them. And he's chasing after them in like the massive clown shoes. So it's not going like great, because I don't think those are really designed to provide like traction or agility. And he's yelling for people to help him. He's yelling for people to stop these children, and no one responds at all. So he follows them down this alley where they surprise him and proceed to just beat the shit out of him. And I didn't notice this the first time I saw the movie, but the second time I noticed that once he's on the ground, Arthur kind of curls on his side and instinctively he covers the back of his neck and his genitals, which to me is the behavior of someone who's like pretty accustomed to getting the hell beaten out of them. He knows what to protect and he knows how to just lie there and take the beating. And so on my second viewing, that scene was way sadder than it was the first time. Todd Phillips also describes Arthur as someone with music in his soul. He points out that Arthur has grace to him and that if he could just connect with that, he'd be better off. And I think Todd Phillips is right. But the only time that we really see that grace in Arthur is when he is dancing, which we'll cover later, or when he is actively clowning. When he's moving through the world just being a person, he has some of the tensest body language that I've ever seen. There's this scene where his back is to the camera and he's like bending his clown shoes to make them more flexible, I guess. Apparently clown shoes are like ballet shoes and you've got to break them in, who knew? And just the tension in his back and in his spine is like almost physically painful to watch, and further proof that Joaquin Phoenix is a straight up genius. A side note, if you haven't seen Her, go watch that. It's on Netflix. He's incredible in it. It's a great movie. Another thing we learn about Arthur early on is that he does have a traumatic brain injury. And there are a lot of things that can happen to someone who has a traumatic brain injury. Really common things are, memory loss or impulse control issues, other behavioral changes. And if that traumatic brain injury happens to occur in childhood, as Arthur's does, it can impact your development. And I think that's really clear when Arthur is kind of fantasizing about being on the Murray Franklin show. When he stands up and he's talking, he reminded me of like a really proud 8-year-old. Like, if a little kid just got a super good test score or, scored a goal at his soccer game or whatever, the way that they talk about it and this kind of back and forthy Rocky thing he does seemed very childlike and innocent to me. And we never see Arthur behave like that unless he is imagining a reality for himself, which kind of leads me to believe that that's who he would be if he felt safe to be it. But Arthur really doesn't feel safe in any part of his life until the end. Another thing I want to note about Arthur is how incredibly good he is at compartmentalizing his feelings. More than once in the film, we see Arthur kind of start to emote something difficult and just shut it down so quickly. And that's something I see really commonly in survivors of severe trauma. They know that emotions are not helpful and that emotions do not make it easy for you to survive difficult situations. And so when those feelings come up, they shut them down as quickly as humanly possible. And you can definitely see that in the way that Joaquin plays Arthur. Finally, and one of the most important things I think about Arthur is that it's very evident very early in the film that almost all of Arthur's energy goes outwards. He does not take care of himself. He takes care of the people around him. He takes care of his mother. He takes care of the people he entertains as a clown. He's very thoughtful and gentle with everyone that he encounters. But he doesn't give any of that to himself. For instance, we never see Arthur eat in the entire film, and he is painfully skinny. I think Joaquin lost 40 or 50 pounds to play the role. He's very skinny. And that kind of indicates that this issue he's having with taking care of himself is probably a pretty long-term issue. Another thing we learn early on is that Arthur is in therapy, but as we've discussed, those services are going to be cut. And honestly, this therapist he's seeing is garbage. She is not helpful at all. She asks him these super inane questions and has him keep this journal that he calls a joke book because he wants to be a comedian. I'm not real sure what this woman thought she was doing, but I don't think it was helpful to him at all. And once she announces to him that his services have been cut, she follows that up by saying, "These people don't give a shit about you," which is not a helpful thing to say to someone who is profoundly depressed and coping with really serious mental illness. Piling on his already negative thoughts? Super bad idea. Don't do that. She's terrible. And if Gotham has a licensure board, someone should report her because she's just doing the worst job. Okay, so that's Arthur. Now we need to talk about mothers and fathers. So Arthur's mother is Penny Fleck. She's played by Frances Conroy, who is an incredible actress. I love her, and she was really well suited for this role. The casting in general in this film is incredible. Everyone is basically exactly who they ought to be. It's fantastic. So when we first meet Penny, she is a sweet, mild-mannered, kind of sickly older lady. And it turns out that that's not her whole situation. We learn later that Penny has been institutionalized multiple times and really struggles with delusional thinking. The diagnoses that we're giving for her are delusional psychosis, which is not currently a diagnosis in the DSM, but this film takes place in an unknown time period, as well as narcissistic personality disorder. I think at some point we're going to have to do an entire video about narcissists because it's becoming such a popular topic. And I think a lot of people don't quite understand what I mean by that. But in general, a narcissist is someone who is consumed with self. They rely very heavily on others to give them a reflected sense of self, and they will manipulate, lie, and gaslight to create the sense of self that they want. It's very obvious that that's something that Penny has done for Arthur's entire life. There's a point in the film where Arthur is at Arkham Asylum and he's getting Penny's chart so that he can see if she was truly institutionalized the way that he was told that she was. And what we learn is that the reason that Arthur has his TBI, the reason that he has that neurological issue where he compulsively and impulsively laughs in inappropriate situations is because Penny basically stood by while a boyfriend of hers beat Arthur and caused severe brain damage. She's sweet and she's mild-mannered, but I think it's fair to say that that's all a lie. She seems very consumed with wealth and status. One thing that was interesting, I don't really know where to go with this, but you see Gotham as this filthy, trash-strewn, gross, oppressive city, and Arthur and Penny's apartment is like carefully decorated the way that my Nana might decorate something. There's like pink wallpaper with birds and green couches and like little knickknacks everywhere. So Penny is creating this environment that's completely counter to the environment that people are actually living in. I don't think that she ever leaves that apartment. I'm pretty sure that she stays in there. Penny calls him Happy. She never calls him Arthur, she calls him Happy, which is kind of fucked up given how sad the guy is. She makes these comments about how he was such a happy baby, he never cried when he was a child, and that's usually an effect of profound emotional neglect. Children who aren't properly cared for and responded to, they learn super early on that crying gets them nowhere, so they stop. It's pretty eerie, actually. The things that like a normal 1 and 2 year old might cry about, someone who's endured severe emotional neglect or profound trauma is not going to cry about, because crying is useless to them. It's not a helpful survival skill because their cries in the past have not been responded to. It's very clear that Penny is not like a good caretaker or mother. The opposite, actually. She is a black hole of need. She requires a lot of Arthur, both physically and emotionally. She's not able to care for herself. So this is maybe kind of a stretch, but I actually think that Murray Franklin, who's played by Robert De Niro in the movie, is a sort of father figure for Arthur. Penny's clearly super obsessed with him. They've been watching this show for years and years and years. And the way that Arthur engages with the show and the fantasies that he has about the show suggests to me that he sees Murray as a father figure. Unfortunately, in the end, when Arthur finally does get to go on Murray's show, Murray rejects him. He mocks him on television. He makes fun of him. He holds him up as something to ridicule. And I think that sort of rejection really triggers the way that this film ends. Another thing we learn, and this fits in with Penny's delusional stuff, is that she believes and convinces Arthur that Thomas Wayne is his father. The lore of the film, Penny worked for the Waynes for a long time, and she tells Arthur that she had an affair with Thomas Wayne. So Arthur becomes convinced that Thomas Wayne is his father, and then he confronts him, and Thomas Wayne calls him a joke and a loser and makes fun of him and dismisses him. And that's something we see a lot. Arthur is largely dismissed by people in this film. The only people he can seem to get to actually engage with him are children. But their parents see him as kind of a weirdo because of the compulsive laughter and how thin he is, and they push them away from him. So the few occasions that Arthur has to truly connect with someone, he's not really able to capitalize on. So now we need to talk about body mechanics. Arthur dances a lot in this movie. The first time it happens is early on. There's an incident that ends with Arthur shooting 3 people on a train, and he runs away from the scene, and he gets to this really gross bathroom, and he does this like really beautiful, almost Tai Chi-like dance. I looked it up. That actually was not supposed to happen. The original plan was that Arthur was supposed to come into that bathroom and lock the door and like cry and vomit and be horrified by what he'd just done. But when they filmed that version of it, they realized that it wasn't quite right. And I agree. If that's what had happened, I would have been kind of annoyed by it. It didn't fit with Arthur's character, and it doesn't fit with the story arc. So instead, he does this beautiful dance. And he does this dancing periodically throughout the film in different ways at different times. So I doubt anyone normal would get here, but this is where I'm at with it. There is a particular kind of therapy. It's called somatic experiencing. And the idea of somatic experiencing goes back to the idea that trauma, even trauma that we don't remember, is stored in our body. So somatic experiencing works to access those felt senses within the body and express them in a way that's healing. I know it sounds kind of new agey and weird, but it's actually super cool and really effective. And as soon as I have that much money to dedicate to learning how to do it, it's something I'm adding to my life. But the way that Arthur dances and like the slow, deliberate movements of it reminded me so much of the sort of movements people do when they're doing somatic experiencing therapy, that I have to believe that Arthur is working some stuff out for himself in those moments. All this frenetic energy, all of this misery, all of this anger that he's felt for so long, I feel like it comes out in those dances. Both the beautiful one, like in the bathroom, and the like headline crazy, like rock and roll number that happens on those stairs, which if you've been on the internet at all lately, you've probably seen. The other thing I want to talk about with body mechanics is the idea that violence can feel like power, particularly if you are someone who is used to feeling powerless. I've noticed this in a lot of my clients, actually. People who feel very helpless and who feel like they can't just exist in the world or make changes the way that they want to, they often express needs to smash things and to break things and to throw things. They just want to feel like they have some sort of agency in the world. And for a lot of people who don't have any power and don't have any agency, violence can feel like the same thing. And to a certain extent it is, until you get into the moral consequences of that sort of thing. So that takes us over here to the idea of agency and locus control. Locus of control is an idea from human development. The idea is some of us have internal locuses of control and some of us have external locuses of control. If you have an internal locus of control, you believe that you are an active agent in your own life. You have the power to make moves and make changes, and you are in control of yourself. If you have an external locus of control, you believe that stuff just happens to you, that you have minimal control over the world around you, that you are prone to attracting negative events. You have no sense of agency because it feels like the world is happening around you and you're just forced to live with the consequences. Obviously, Arthur is someone who largely has an external locus of control until the event on the train where he murders those 3 men. And for the first time, he feels like he has some power in his own life. Like the choices he makes and the moves that he executes have a larger meaning and a larger purpose, if only for himself. And that's an important feeling. Everyone needs that. People in general who are especially prone to depression and anxiety tend to be people who don't feel like they have that sense of agency. So I want to go back now and talk about Gary. There are a couple of people who also work at this clown agency that Arthur interacts with more than others. And one is Gary. He's played by Lee Gill in one of the... It's such a good movie, guys. And Lee Gill is incredible in it. So Lee Gill is a little person, and he, like Arthur, is mostly mocked and ridiculed by their coworkers. So towards the end of the film, Randall, another one of the clowns, who is the one who gave Arthur the gun that he used to kill those men on the train, come to their apartment, Randall and Gary, to... Basically, Randall wants to figure out if Arthur is going to out him. And Arthur hates Randall, which is reasonable, because as previously mentioned, Randall is a dick. Arthur winds up attacking Randall and really brutally murders him in Arthur's home. And Gary is standing right there and is, horrified, as you would be if someone killed a man with a pair of scissors in front of you. But after this shocking moment of violence, there's this really beautiful moment between Arthur and Gary. Gary starts to kind of plead for his life because he reasonably assumes that he is next. And instead, Arthur says, "You are the only one who was ever nice to me." And then he tells him not to look at Randall's body and to just go. And then Gary gets to the door. And this is when my favorite thing both times I saw this movie happened. Not in the movie, but in the theater. Gary's a little person. He can't reach the lock to leave the apartment. And it's not played up in the film to be funny, but the people in the theater around me laughed. Arthur doesn't. Arthur says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot." And he gets up off the floor and unlocks the door for Gary. Because Arthur, unlike all of their coworkers, sees Gary as a person. Not a person who is short, not a person to be made fun of, but just a person. And that little moment of kindness is so important because I think it shows that Arthur's not a monster. He's just trying to cope with the forces around him. And he understands that kindness is an important thing. It's really nice. Okay, so enough of Gary. Let's talk about the whole idea of putting on a happy face. So I mentioned earlier that Arthur's therapist has him keep a journal. Arthur actually uses it as what he calls a joke book because he's like trying to be a stand-up comedian, which he's real terrible at. But the things that you see written in this notebook are not like funny. They're mostly profoundly sad. Little snippets that we see include, I just hope that my death makes more sense than my life. And my favorite quote of perhaps the whole movie, which is never actually said out loud, the hardest part of having a mental illness is that people expect you to behave like you don't have one. But we also really prominently see this phrase with the goofy little smiley face, put on a happy face. We talked earlier about Arthur thinking that his purpose is to bring laughter and joy to people. And that's so counter to how Arthur actually feels that I think that creates a lot of the tension and conflict inside of him. At one point in the film, he says to his therapist, all I have are negative thoughts. Later on, he says to his mother, I haven't been happy a single fucking day in my life. And yet his nickname is Happy. He believes that his job in the world is to make other people happy. And you can see how much this negatively affects him. And part about I love about that whole idea is how often we, as just like regular people who aren't in a movie, do exactly the same thing. We operate under this belief that it is our job to be fine. It's our job not to have too many feelings, and if we do have too many feelings, to keep those contained. And I've never quite figured out if this is something like unique to the Midwest where I live, but it does seem to be worse here. We just have this like cultural commitment to fineness. And it's all a fucking lie. Like, no one is as fine as they're pretending to be. Every single one of us, probably within the next week, is going to be asked, how are you today? And we're going to say, fine. More than once, I've had people come into my office and I've started our therapy session by saying, how are you today? And my client has said, I'm fine. And then immediately started crying because they're not fine. But it's so automatic and programmed into us to say that we're fine that I'm honestly not sure how often we actually like stop and think about our emotional reality. And this could be the worst movie ever. And if that part was still in it, I'd still love it and have seen it twice, maybe 3 times. I don't know. Because we lie too much about how we're feeling. It's a real problem. Okay, so on that note, let's talk about the medicine of attention. And probably like 8 people are going to realize that I stole the phrase medicine of attention from a podcast called Harmontown, because it's a brilliant phrase and I like it. And there is clinical significance to attention. There's actually been studies trying to figure out like, what is it about therapy that works for people? Why does it cause change? Why is it helpful? And what that research has shown overwhelmingly is that 70% of what's great about therapy has absolutely nothing to do with what kind of therapy I practice. All these theories and methods that I've spent so much time and money learning are like 15% of what's useful to clients. That's it. The rest of it rides on the relationship that I build with you as my client, how much you trust me as your therapist, and how able and willing you are to take what we talk about into the world and make change. But the core there is the medicine of attention. It's me investing in you emotionally and you feeling safe to invest in me. And that's true across our entire lives, not just in therapy. We have this like weird embarrassment around needing attention. We like make fun of each other for attention seeking. We talk about attention seeking like it's this deeply negative thing, but it's a literal human need. We need to be recognized. We need to be told that we exist. We live in a world with other people, and if they're not looking at us and they're not seeing us, how do we know that we're real? There's actually like a super rare psychological condition. It's called Cotard syndrome, and people who have it believe that they're dead and that no one knows it and no one has told them. It's incredibly rare. It happens to almost no one, but when it does, it's really interesting Because how do you convince someone that they exist when they so deeply believe that they don't? It's like a reverse sixth sense. Off topic, but anyway. Arthur has some very clear needs to feel special and important. And I think a lot of that goes back to good old Penny, who was so consumed with being special and important herself, she never bothered to give that to her child. And that's a key component of adequate parenting, is like engaging with your kid and letting them know that they matter and that the things that they think and the things that they feel are real and carry some kind of weight in the world. And Arthur didn't get that. So these fantasies we see him have, where he imagines himself on Murray's show and where he makes up an entire relationship with his neighbor, who's played by Zazie Beetz, and I love her, and if she sees this, please call me. It's not about sex. That fantasy of that relationship is not even really sexual at all. Like, it's just about her seeing him and engaging with him and being a positive influence in his life. When we find out that that relationship did not happen, we see Arthur go into her apartment and sit quietly on the couch. And when she sees him in there, she freaks out because there's a strange man in her apartment. And all he says to her is, "I had a really bad day." Which is the kind of thing you would say to someone who you thought you could trust with your emotional reality. Arthur is deeply deprived of the medicine of attention. And that is so important to us being thriving, surviving, functional human beings. Our brains are wired to make it possible for us to connect to each other. They have developed all these parts that other animals do not share because we need so many unique skills to engage with each other on the level that we need to engage in to be able to be a functional species. There was a time, not actually that long ago, where to be rejected was to literally die. When our societies were tribal and insulated, if your society cast you out and you were alone now, you probably weren't going to make it. That's why so many of us have profound fear of rejection, because rejection, to our lizard brains that don't know any better, is the same thing as dying. They're that close together. So this whole idea of the medicine of attention comes into play repeatedly in this movie because Arthur needs it so badly, which transitions us nicely into the idea of nihilism. And I hesitated to use the word nihilism because, like, technically Joker's more of like an absurdist, but it doesn't really matter. Nihilism is essentially the idea that nothing matters and you don't care about anything. It's a particularly attractive idea to people who are profoundly depressed and have been for a long time and have little agency or resources to change that for themselves. And I think that's a pretty accurate picture of where Arthur's at in his life. Something else that's interesting about the end of this film. So Arthur winds up going on the Murray show and Murray makes fun of him and Arthur realizes it. He's not stupid, he knows what's going on, and he throws it back in Murray's face. And some of the things that Arthur says to Murray go back to this idea of the medicine of attention. He talks about how if he were dying in the street, people would walk right by him. He talks about how no one has seen him and no one has cared, but now that they think he's a bad person, everyone's obsessed with him. Arthur has internalized his depression to the point where everything seems pointless to him. And that's reflected also in what actually is the theme song to the Murray Show, which is that old Sinatra song, That's Life. Look up the lyrics to this song. It's a bummer. Why would you pick that as the theme song for a nightly television show? It is beyond me. Anyway, if you look at the lyrics are about how, bad stuff happens, good stuff happens, you just kind of roll with it. And while I was doing research for this video, like watching a million interviews and reading a bunch of reviews and sorting through thousands of Reddit comments, one of the comments that I saw said something about how overblown this movie is, because this isn't how life works. You don't have bad luck every single day. Things don't get this bad. If you lose your job, as Arthur does, you go get a new one. And I got physically angry at an anonymous Reddit poster because for some people, that is how life is. Sometimes things just go wrong and go wrong and go wrong. And if you don't have the resources or the sense of agency to be able to make the changes that you need to change, you're just stuck there. And Arthur winds up stuck there. And I think that's why he falls into this nihilism. If nothing you do has any positive effect on your life, then why for even a minute would you believe that you have any control or you have any impact on the world around you or even yourself? So at the very end of the movie, Arthur brings a gun with him to be on Murray's show. And you see him in his home rehearsing to be on the Murray Show. And he's rehearsing by watching videos of very charismatic guests who have been on the show before. He's rehearsing how to be likable. And he actually carries it off pretty good, I thought, when he's actually on the show. But while he's rehearsing, his rehearsal includes pantomiming killing himself. He pantomimes shooting himself in the head. And it's clear that that's his plan. He's going to get all dressed up and he's going to go on television and he's going to kill himself. But Murray prods him so much and ridicules him so much that Arthur actually winds up killing Murray on television for the world to see, which triggers a riot. And so when he shoots him, he says, "I've got another joke for you, Murray. What do you get when you cross a mentally ill loner with a society who doesn't care about him?" And then he says, "You get what you fucking deserve." And I don't agree with that, because we are all individually responsible for our own choices and our own actions. But in the context of this movie, it makes a certain kind of sense. I really believe, both on camera and off, Arthur did everything he could think of to improve his life and find resources and help for himself. And every single one of them wound up being a dead end. And when you run out of reasonable options, you're not left with a lot of choices other than to take drastic action. At the very, very end of the movie, we see Arthur being driven away in a police car, and there's riots happening all over Gotham. Things are on fire, people are in the streets breaking stuff, it's a lot. So the cop says something along the lines of like, "All of this is because of you." And Arthur says, "I know, isn't it beautiful?" He finally took action and it had an impact. Like I said, I'm not agreeing with the thesis of this film that violence is a super good idea or that the only way to get people to take you seriously is to like murder them. I don't agree with that at all. What I do think this film is great at, though, is illustrating that we all can only take so much. The whole idea that someone just snapped is false. People don't snap all at once. There's lots and lots of little things that strip you of your dignity and make you feel hopeless and helpless. And that causes people to lash out. So what did we learn from Joker? A few things, I think. First of all, we were reminded that Joaquin Phoenix is an incredible actor and we should never, ever underestimate him. I think we also learned that our mental health system is deeply broken. I know that Gotham is a fictional city, but the American healthcare system does not adequately provide for the mental health care needs of millions of people. As I told you a long time ago, I spent the first 5 years of my career working for a community mental health agency, which is funded primarily through state money, with people in very poor, very rural communities. Those people then did not have the access to what they needed. And I have no doubt that it's gotten worse since I've been gone. Our healthcare system is not designed to assist the people who most need assistance. Because if you are struggling as much as Arthur is struggling, the chances of you being able to hold down a steady, well-paying job with health benefits, pretty slim. And based on the British people I follow on Twitter, it seems like they have some very similar issues. So I'm inclined to believe that this is presently a worldwide epidemic, or our mental health care is just not adequate to meet the needs of our people. Call your congressman or something, because at some point we have to do something. It's absolutely heartbreaking how many people need help and are unable to get it. Another thing I think we learned pretty clearly is that attention and connection matter. They are deeply important to us as human beings. As much as you can give that to the people around you, give it to them. And if you need it, don't be ashamed to ask for it. Attention is how we know we exist. It's how we know we matter. We should never feel shame about needing something essential to our development and growth as human beings. We also learned that kindness matters. And I think Gary is a really good example of that. I want to talk about closure a little bit too, because part of the reason that Arthur goes to Arkham Asylum and looks at Penny's file is because he's seeking closure. He wants to feel like he understands what's going on. And closure is something that a lot of people ask for. It's a thing a lot of people seek. It's a reason a lot of people come to therapy, because they didn't get the closure they needed and they're hoping to. The mistake that a lot of us make is that we think that closure is something that we get from other people. And it's not. Closure is what we make for ourselves. Closure is the meaning that we take away from our life experiences and how we choose to apply that to ourselves moving forward. You don't need permission for closure. You don't need the person who wronged you to agree with your narrative for closure. I'm going to pull this down and read it to you. You got to understand that some people never really grow. They never learn their lesson. They never recognize their mistakes. They never acknowledge their faults. They never admit they were in the wrong. You will never receive an apology from them, and you will never see their behavior change. A lot of people wind up stuck on that idea, that if they could get the apology or if they could see that things were different, they would get the closure that they need. But that's not how it works. You can take that closure for yourself by recognizing that the thing you think you need is a thing you're not going to get. And it's proof that you don't deserve to feel as bad about whatever happened to you as you do. That's the other big takeaway from this movie, that we need to be thoughtful in how we choose to seek closure in our lives. Too often I see clients and friends really string themselves out emotionally, trying to achieve some closure that they may never get. The last thing that I think that we really learned is not to put on a happy face, that we shouldn't hide the things that hurt us. In fact, hiding the things that hurts us gives it a level of power that it doesn't deserve. If something that you're struggling with feels so unspeakable that you have to sit in that misery alone, that's how you know you need to say something about it. Because the longer you keep it in the dark, the more power it generates. So earlier I mentioned the podcast Harmontown, which is hosted by Dan Harmon. If you're not familiar with him, he is the creator of two of my favorite shows, Community and Rick and Morty. He is a fascinating individual. But a while ago on Twitter, someone tweeted at Dan and asked for help coping with depression. And the response that Dan laid out is one of the best responses for how to deal with depression that I've ever seen. He said, for one, admit and accept that it's happening. Awareness is everything. We put ourselves under so much pressure to feel good. It's okay to feel bad. It might be something you're good at. Communicate it and don't keep it a secret. Own it, like a hat or a jacket. Your feelings are real. 2, try to remind yourself over and over that feelings are real, but they aren't reality. Example, you can feel like life means nothing. True feeling, important feeling. True that you feel it, but whether life has meaning is not up to us. Facts and feelings are equal, but they are different. The most important thing I can say to you is please don't deal with it alone. This is an incredible, miraculous magic to pushing your feelings out. Even writing "I want to die" on a piece of paper and burning it will feel better than thinking about it alone. Output is magical. Dark thoughts will echo off the walls of your skull. They will distort and magnify. When you open your mouth or an anonymous journal or blog or sketch pad, those thoughts go out. They'll be back, but you gotta get them out. Vent them, tap them. I know you don't want to, but try it. Just get it out. Find someone you trust and talk about how you're feeling. Because the longer you don't, the more power it develops and the more powerless you feel before it. Find a therapist, find a friend, call your mom. Do something. Talk to someone about how you're feeling. Don't ever for a minute think it's not important, because it is. That's it, guys. That's my incredibly long video about the Joker. If you liked it, tell your friends. If you hated it, tell me in the comments or on Twitter, or you can email me. Like my video and watch it, and watch the other ones, because they're also good and shorter and a little less crazy and less, disrupted by failing double-sided tape. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.